I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Darug land on which I'm giving this presentation today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge that this land, which I benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded by the Darug people. Generally speaking, I don't like to start presentations by talking about myself. However, in this case, I think it's probably relevant to start by letting you know who I am and why I'm qualified to talk about this stuff. I've got multiple management degrees, including an MBA that I completed in 2019. So that means I've learned a lot of management theory. Perhaps more importantly though, I've managed a number of different documentation teams during my career. My first team started with 4 people and ended up with 13. My second team started with 2 people, including me, and ended up with 9. My third team was an open source community group, which was an elected position staffed entirely with volunteers. I can and have given talks on leading open source groups, but I'm not going to go into that level of detail here. Let's just say that that experience has definitely influenced my management style in many ways, mostly for the better. My fourth team was a tiny little Australian startup that started with me as the sole writer and ended up with 2 people before the company imploded. Finally, my fifth and current team at Timescale started with me as the sole writer for 7 months and is now currently sitting at 3 with the intention of continuing to grow. And if you hear this talk and are interested in coming to join us at Timescale, I'll have a link for you at the end where you can take a look at our current openings. As with technical documentation, when you're going to start a docs team, you need to start with planning. This is important if you're a sole author, madly trying to convince management that you need help, or if you just got that phone call that says you have approval to start hiring. Even if you already have a team member or 2, it's not too late to take yourself through a planning process, because the information and insight you get from the process will help you as you continue to grow your team. This quote is a little trite, but I think the sentiment is a good one. In essence, you don't want to be thinking of yourself as the head of a great and mighty team, beloved and feared in equal measure by your subordinates. It is important to think about your team as the people who enable you to do your best work. Remember that without them, you're never going to be able to take a vacation. So the first thing I want to encourage you to do is think about what kind of manager you want to be. This plays deeply into your own personality and style, and it's important to be honest with yourself. Don't set your team up in such a way that they need to come to you to ask for work items if you're the kind of person who doesn't like being interrupted a lot, or if you work in a different time zone. Make sure that your team structure and processes work for you and for your management style. With that in mind, I like to think of my docs team less in terms of hierarchies and more in terms of Voltron. I'm hoping there are a few 90s kids in the audience who can remember this, but the essence is that 4 of the explorers each formed a limb of the giant robot Voltron, with the 5th forming the head. You all need to work together in equal parts, even though only one of you is the manager. In this kind of model, my team members know they can come to me if they need assistance or guidance, but they also have their own part to play, and mostly they're able to work out what they need to do on their own without constantly checking back in with me. This allows them to work on their own tasks at their own pace, and it means I have the freedom and time to be able to work deeply on my own tasks as well. This is also really important for distributed teams, where you might have people working during hours when you, and sometimes the rest of your team, are in bed. Next, you need to start thinking about how you want to structure your team. Mostly, this comes down to what your business looks like. If you're writing documentation for multiple products, then you might want specialized writers for each product. Or you might consider working more on a services model, where writers are assigned to projects as they come up, and that might mean you need more generalists. You might also need to think a little larger than you expect at this stage. You might only have approval for 1 writer now, but consider what things will look like when you have 5, 10, or even 20 writers. How will people grow and change within your docs organization? How will you assign writers to tasks? What happens if someone is sick or takes an extended absence? How can you bring in specialists such as information architects, technical editors, or content strategists, and how will they fit into the team? How will your team work with front-end developers or documentation engineers? I'll come back to these topics in a little bit later. When you've had a think about the kind of leader you want to be and the basic structure you want your team to have, it's time to start looking at the people you need on your team. It's important that you don't just hire clones of yourself. And I know that sounds really obvious, but you might be surprised at how hard it is to do. As an example, I give you two fictional potential technical writers. As I read this out, have a think about who you would prefer to hire. Kim's references are spectacular, you got along well with her, and all her interviewers loved her. Kim recently completed her degree and has no substantial experience in the field. Jane has a history of being productive and her references are excellent, but her interviews were significantly less sparkling than Kim's. Jane has held a similar position for 3 years. Now, intuitively, you might want to hire Kim just because you got along with her so well, as did the other interviewers. But objectively, we have a lot less information about Kim than we do about Jane. In the context of hiring, you should probably hire Jane, but it could be a struggle to overcome the intuitive impression that Kim could have been a better fit. Our brains are wired to go for the intuitive answer, and we find making intuitive choices a lot more natural and in some ways more pleasing. You would probably feel better about hiring Kim, even if you realize that Jane is more likely to succeed. Another way to ensure you hire people who are not like yourself is to make sure you're reaching outside of your own networks. Personally, when I've been hiring for a position, I've had a lot of great candidates come directly through the Write the Docs community. And it would be very tempting to only seek candidates through communities like ours, because you know you're going to get highly qualified, engaged candidates. But think back to before you joined the Write the Docs community. You weren't any less a great technical writer, I'm sure, just because you hadn't joined up. Also, communities can be prone to a certain level of groupthink. You should grab candidates from wherever you can find them, from all walks of life, all levels of background and ability, and all different kinds of communities. One of the major takeaways I had from my MBA Human Resources class was that interviews are the single worst way to find out what someone knows. Unfortunately, we're stuck with them, so you're going to have to make the most of it. There are two main things you can do here. Start by deciding what the overall interview process looks like. Screenings, panel interviews, writing tests, one-on-one interviews, all of that. And make sure it stays the same for every single person you interview for the position. If you discover that you want to change things as you're going through the process, that's fine, but do it for the next position you hire for. Don't change things up halfway through. Then, write down all the questions you want to ask and make a scorecard to mark people's responses against. Use the same questions and scorecard for each person you interview. Consistency is the single most important thing you can do to make sure that your interviews are a useful selection tool and not just a waste of everyone's time. I gave a version of this talk many years ago when I was building team number 2, and I recently revisited that talk. In it, I struggled openly with the idea of hiring friends, and if I'm honest, I still do. But since my thinking has come a long way since then, I wanted to address the question again. I have been known to hire the same people 2 or even 3 different times for different teams in different organizations. And it's great. You already know the people, you know how they work, you know their strengths and weaknesses, and you know exactly what kind of team member they're going to be. However, they also know you. They know what to say to please you. They know how much or how little they need to do to be considered successful, and they know what they can get away with. Hiring your friends is the very definition of hiring clones of yourself. So while I'm not saying you should never hire your friends, that would be a little bit hypocritical of me, you do need to make sure you go in with your eyes wide open. Make sure you make it very clear to others on the hiring panel or in your HR team that that you know the person personally or that you've worked with them before, and see if you can tweak the interviews to remove bias wherever possible. If you are supposed to be conducting an interview yourself, have a peer do it instead, or you could have someone silently sit in on the interview so that they can check your responses against your scorecard. Hopefully, by the time you've gone through a bunch of interviews, aside from being absolutely sick to death of interviewing, you'll have a good idea of who you're going to hire. Here's where it's important, again, to rail a little bit against your intuition. You're not trying to pick friends to go down to the pub with. Hire the person that has the most relevant experience, that has the more appropriate qualifications, and was most able to demonstrate that they have the right skills, even if you didn't get along all that well with them. It'll feel difficult to do, and it might feel like you're going against your gut, which we all hate doing, but your animal brain is trying to trick you here, and you need to tell it to keep downing back. Perhaps one of the scariest things you ever have to do as a manager is double the size of your team overnight. Hopefully, your first hire is someone who's going to be able to cope with your fledgling docs team, and with any luck, you've explained the situation carefully during the interview process so that they realize what they're walking into. You really don't want them turning up on their first day and asking where everyone else is, or expecting that they're going to have a lot of formal processes and procedures in place. Make sure you've already addressed those issues before their first day. Before your new hire starts, put some time into writing a hiring plan for them. I like to use Google Docs for this so that they can comment on it and you can interact with them. The hiring plan should explain what your part of the group does exactly, how you fit into the larger organization, important people they need to speak to, software and other tools that they need to make sure they can access, and probably a bunch of links out to other important reading for them. I also like to specify some broad goals for the first week, first month, and first 3 months, just so that my new hires feel like they have some kind of direction. Don't make the goals too ambitious. I usually have things like understanding the documentation toolchain, installing and using the product they will be documenting, and getting their first pull request or other change created and merged. Don't be surprised if you're as nervous on your new hire's first day as they are. But don't let that mean that you crowd them. Send them an email ahead of their scheduled start time, preferably the night before, to an account that you know they have access to, which could be their personal email account. You don't need to say much, just reintroduce yourself as their manager, welcome them aboard, and give them any essential information they might need, like how to get into their building, find their desk, or how to sign into their accounts. You should also send them the hiring plan document that you prepared for them with a note that you'll go through it with them in more detail when you meet up. This gives them something to read through and start digesting, even if they don't fully understand it yet. Then, book a meeting with them late on their first day or in the morning of their second day, when you can start dumping reading material and other information on them. One of the first things you're going to notice are all the things that you do without thinking too much about them. Things like checking your GitHub and chat notifications, the light grooming of the backlog, the way you fill out a pull request, the tags you use to organize and sort work tasks, the way you reply to requests from internal and external readers, even just the things you check when you're editing, those style guide things. A whole lot of that stuff is probably kept in your head. And this is all because of the curse of knowledge. As writers, we're familiar with the idea that the more you know about something, the less able you are to describe it. So keep in mind that this happens with people management too. Whenever you come up against one of these little things that you didn't realize you did, write it down. Start with whatever tool you use for internal documentation, a wiki or a document that other people in your organization can access. Later on, you can consider turning it into something more formal if you need to. The most important thing is that your team members can go and look it up when they need to know, rather than having to come to you and ask. And when you do get asked questions directly about processes, write down the answers so you don't get asked a second time. Think of it as planning for you to have some time off in the future without being bugged by super urgent direct messages while you're sipping cocktails on the beach. While you're writing down all this stuff about processes, it's easy to start thinking in terms of, well, let's make it a rule that this gets done this way, or let's enforce this particular task. But that way lies madness, my friends. When I was a kid, my mum had a strict rule that her sewing scissors were only to be used for fabric. Those scissors were nothing particularly special, but if I needed to cut something, anything, you can bet I was going for mum's sewing scissors first. If you make rules for the sake of making rules, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Save the rule making for when you truly need it. That way, your team members won't feel like they're being micromanaged, and when you do make a hard and fast rule, it will be more meaningful and is more likely to stick. So hiring the first person is the hardest bit, but the challenges you face will change dramatically as you go from a small team to a big team. Take it from me that trying to directly manage any more than 10 people is a bad idea. Personally, I prefer to stick to around 5 direct reports if I possibly can. Let me share an embarrassing story about this from my first team. We were working in a physical office and we had an evacuation alarm go off at about 8:30 in the morning. I was in the car park, so I walked out to the street and up to the evacuation point without going into the office. I had no idea who was in the office and who wasn't in yet, so I just started sending texts out to all my team members, checking on where they were and getting them out to the evacuation point. It was only after we were allowed back in the building that I realised I had completely forgotten one of my team. Now, it ended okay. It turned out she hadn't gone into the office yet, but that could have ended up with a team member trapped in a burning building, and I would have had no idea until it was too late. If you can't reliably remember every single one of your direct reports under pressure, you have too many direct reports. If you find yourself in that kind of situation, you need to set up some teams. You can do this several ways, but one thing I would recommend is that you ensure the groups are porous. Make sure it's easy for people to move in and out of different groups, that all your processes stay the same across groups, and that you're keeping on top of culture and social issues. The leaders of each group should be your direct reports. Make sure you're meeting with your directs regularly, weekly if you can, but don't neglect the people who report to them as well. Make sure you keep yourself available to them, speak directly to them whenever you can, and don't be afraid to have regular one-on-one meetings with them. Just keep it to a less frequent pace than your directs, say once a quarter or so. Team leadership is a great way for people who want to move into management to try out a low-stakes leadership role. And it's a great way for you to expand your management skills by managing managers. Which brings me neatly to the next point, which is that you need to consider the career paths you're offering your team. I'm very much in favour of providing 2 career tracks within my teams. One for people who want to go into traditional leadership roles, and one for people who want to grow in a technical role without taking on management tasks. A technical career track in a docs organisation would typically lead up to roles like information architect, documentation engineer, or content strategist. And it's important to remember when you're talking about career tracks with your team members too, that not everyone is going to want to stay in a documentation team. You may lose team members to roles in engineering, project management, or marketing, and that's okay. You need to make sure you're helping your team members achieve the things that are right for them, even if that takes them out of your team. I mentioned this topic briefly at the beginning of the talk, but I'd like to revisit the idea of team structure. Let's imagine that you have 5 writers and 3 main product lines. It's tempting to put 3 writers on your biggest product and then have the other 2 dedicated to the smaller products. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem. Everyone talks to each other, we're sharing ideas, we're all using the same tools, we can all come to each other for help. The problem arises when Alex over on product A gets sick or quits, and someone has to pick up that work. At that point, you realize that Alex had a bunch of product knowledge that no one else has. They've been attending product meetings, established relationships with developers, and been playing with the product for some time. And that's not something someone else can easily step into on a moment's notice. Some things you can mitigate by implementing policies about frequent reporting, making sure all work, including drafts, is done in public, and recording meetings and meeting notes wherever possible. But product knowledge is hard won by your team members, and no amount of note-taking or policy making is going to mitigate that kind of knowledge loss. Here are some suggestions. If you want to keep your dedicated writers, implement some job shadowing. This allows people to go and spend a few days or a week working on another product with the dedicated writer. It won't fully resolve the problem, but at least you have someone else in the team who can help pick up the threads if they need to. The alternative, which I prefer, is to use a services model, where the documentation team acts as a consulting agency to engineering. A docs request comes in, and someone takes it. Product teams won't get the same writer every time, but work gets done by the next available writer. This means that deliverables won't fall through the cracks if writers are taking time off, and best of all, when people leave your group, you don't lose an entire body of knowledge as well. I'm sure that you've realized by my accent by now that I live on the wrong side of the world. That means that I spend a whole lot more time thinking about time zones than most people. If you are based in an office and all your team are with you in that same office, then time zones might not be something you think about much, if at all. But with more teams going remote and more companies, like Timescale, being globally remote, time zones are something that you do need to know how to handle. And it's hard. As much as I preach a work ethic of making sure you're having downtime, not checking email on the weekends and that kind of thing, time zones mean sometimes you do need to be working at a time when, let's face it, you would rather not be working. Sometimes you need to take a virtual meeting at 7 a.m, and that's cool. Do it in your pajamas, coffee in hand, and don't be embarrassed if you yawn. It's important to be honest about the time zone you're working in, and also remember that you don't need to say yes to everything. If you have a facility in your organization where others can see your calendar and book meetings, make sure you set your working hours appropriately, and I don't mean 9 to 5. I have set availability in my morning and evening, but have blocked out time around meals to make sure that I get that time with my family. On top of personal considerations, you also need to consider where your team is located. If you have everyone in the continental United States, except one person who is out in Europe, that poor person in Europe is going to feel isolated. That doesn't mean you shouldn't hire people in a different time zone. It just means you need to put in some extra effort to make sure they're included. So let's talk about meetings. Probably the main thing that will drive home to you that you're a manager now is that you'll be doing a whole lot less writing and a whole lot more meetings. Yes, you'll be doing all the meetings you did before, but now you'll also be doing a bunch of one-on-one meetings with your staff, and they're the ones I want to talk about first. If you're anything like me, you will come to a point where you feel like all the one-on-one meetings are probably going to kill you. I'm living proof that they won't, and I am here to tell you that you have to do them anyway. I'm sorry. One-on-one meetings are not there for your benefit. I mean, you will benefit from them, but that's not their primary purpose. Their primary purpose is to communicate to your team members that you care about them. You care about what they're working on, and that you are, above all, listening to them. If you spend your one-on-one meetings doing all the talking, then you're doing them wrong. I like to remind my team members that they set the agenda for their one-on-one meetings with me, whether or not they choose to send me a formal agenda ahead of time. So every one-on-one meeting I have, I always start with a question, such as, how has your week been? Let your team member talk about whatever is on their mind. Work tasks, how they're getting along with other colleagues, tool complaints, anything at all, even their personal lives, if that's what they want to discuss. As they bring each topic up, ask questions, take notes. You do not need to solve every problem, but you do need to be actively listening and find out if there's an action that they would like you to take. If they do ask you to do something, make sure you do it and make sure you report back to them in a timely manner. But above all, make sure your team members feel heard. And that brings us to the dreaded team meeting. This is the meeting where you, as the docs manager, get to do all the talking. How you structure this is entirely up to you, but I would recommend that you at least do some kind of an overview of what people have been working on since your last meeting, and some kind of planning for what's coming up. I also like to make sure I have an open agenda so people can add their own things to the list for discussion. Basically, I use this meeting for calibrating the team on current events and what we're all, as a group, working towards and prioritizing right now. I also use it as a way of me communicating to the entire team. I don't want to be communicating things to individuals in their one-on-ones unless it's specific to that person. Save the general announcements for the team meeting. But if you remember just one thing about meetings, then let it be this. Always praise in public and criticize in private. No backbiting or complaining in the team meeting, and save the advice for your one-on-ones. One thing I've seen lots of people do is use their team meetings for passive-aggressive comments. Things like, and don't forget to use a meaningful commit message. Save that for the one-on-ones with people who actually need the reminder. It'll mean more if it's delivered personally, and it also gives people a chance to ask questions if they genuinely need help, rather than risking embarrassing themselves by asking in a team meeting. I will add that there are exceptions to this rule, but that's usually for serious matters like abuse or bullying, and I'm not going to cover those here. The final note that I want to make about conducting team meetings is to check who has agency. Who is talking the most? Who is answering questions? Who is suggesting agenda items? Who is sitting in the corner not saying anything? Not everyone can or will want to speak up, and you absolutely shouldn't make them, but at least make sure they have the opportunity to do so if they wish. I appreciate that at least some of this talk sounds as though I live in a perfect world, and while timescale is pretty great, I also live here in the real world with all the rest of you. So this final part of my talk is about dealing with things when things aren't going so great. Hiring is hard. And it's also an incredibly imprecise science. So that means that you're not going to get it right every time. Fortunately, most of the time people will pretty quickly work out if they're not fitting in or if they're not enjoying the work. And most people will move on all of their own volition in that case. It's not always going to happen though, and sometimes you do need to intervene before things get toxic. Always start by having an open and honest conversation with the person involved. To prepare for that conversation, you need to start by talking to your own manager and probably your HR department. Not because you want to fire your team member necessarily, but because you need to make sure that you understand what you can and can't do in this situation and what the process is to get to that point. In some jurisdictions, that process can be quite lengthy and require a significant amount of preparation and very careful language. Additionally, your company might have specific rules and regulations you need to follow as well. Once you've had that first conversation with your team member, you might be pleasantly surprised. Many people just don't realize that what they're doing is disruptive or otherwise unhelpful, and most are happy to make some changes. No one wants to put their job in jeopardy, especially if they like the work. Unfortunately, though, that's not always the case, and in that situation, which hopefully is very rare, you will either need to encourage them to find a role more suited to them, or go through the process to actually remove them entirely. Whatever happens, though, make sure you record everything, you remain polite, you work with your management and HR teams, and you continue to act in good faith. And remember to review all your practices afterwards too, to see if you can identify places where you can improve. Team structure problems are in many ways easier to recover from. However, they're often harder to spot. It's entirely possible that you think your team structure is working well, while people on your team think the exact opposite. It's also possible that some people on your team love the way you have things set up and others don't, and sometimes it's for the same reason. The best advice I can give you on this is to keep talking to people. This is the type of conversation you want to be having in your one-on-ones primarily. And don't be afraid to tweak things in your structure and try things out too. You can use your team meetings to say, I've been thinking of trying this thing. What do you all think about that? That way, your staff know that you're up for changing things and that you can take feedback on structure decisions. And I guess the addendum to that is to make sure that you admit when you make a mistake as well. If you change something and it just doesn't hit, change it back. Sometimes you end up in a situation where just everything is terrible. This has happened to me when I've walked in as a new manager to an existing team. If the team has a terrible culture, bad workplace practices and a rotten attitude, it's a difficult ship to turn around. The key here, though, is culture. Encourage open communication, make sure you demonstrate trustworthiness, and engage your team members in the process of improving. It could take a long time, but I promise that it will be worth the hard work in the long run. Finally, I'd like to end on a note from a dedicated leader and public servant who tells us that the reason we do these things is because we get to work hard at work worth doing. Management isn't for everyone, but I personally love the challenge of leading people. For me, it's about taking the time to find out what makes an individual tick and how I can best put them in a place that satisfies them. Whether it's finding them work that they find meaningful, a team that they enjoy spending time with, or just a great atmosphere to rock up and work in every day. It's important to remember that what motivates people is more than just a paycheck. It's also about giving them meaningful work that they enjoy and that they can work hard and excel at. So, go and find your team and get to work. If you want to come and work with me and my team, Timescale are hiring all across the organisation and we are globally remote, so check out our careers page. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate you spending time with me, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you in the live session after this.
I've got a whole bunch of questions, so I'll get into them. And like many things, we've got a lot of enthusiasm about tooling. So the first question for Chris is, what are some of your favorite collaboration tools that help empower writers to be successful with pair writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've been asked this question many a times. We want to keep it as simple as possible, Janine. And what we started off is Google Docs as our main go-to tooling. And then once we have a draft version ready, then we move to Visual Studio Code. That's where we build our .md file and then try to push it to the repo so that the PR gets raised. So that's been very simple. So no fancy tools as such. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We also had questions about what the process looks like. So when you're peer writing a document, do you write down an outline maybe and assign parts of the document to individuals and then everybody peer reviews maybe? Or Valeria, who wrote the question, she's also wondering maybe everybody contributes whatever they can and then a leader reviews and edits instead. Like what does it look like?
Yeah, as I said in the talk, it's a collaborative effort with the pair writing, wherein we were three in this case, and there's always a constant support that's coming from the community itself. So as I said, we jump onto the Slack and we know what we are working on, we understand our goal, and then we do a parallel research, go out on the web and look for content that we want to get into. And once we're there, and then we come back, and then driver, who is in our case Gayatri, would type in the words, and then we discuss a lot. As I said, there would be a lot of conflict that arises during this period. That's when we try to discuss and listen to each other. Once we're still not convinced, definitely there are many times we are not convinced about each other's analogy, and then we take it to the community where we meet weekly, and then we get some guidance from there, and then we'll get back to work, and then the cycle repeats. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I can imagine that would require a really good collaborative dynamic, and so I think that brings us to some questions we got from Lana about hiring. So people are wondering about maybe some red flags, but also green flags that you look for when you're interviewing people. Things that stand out, maybe good or bad ways, things that you really look for that you found have given you teams of people who work well together, I guess.
I think I said in the talk that interviewing is a really terrible way to work out who's a good fit and who isn't. For me, it's quite often about the conversation. I think, as I said, that I plan my questions out ahead of time so everyone gets the same questions. And it's really interesting, especially once you've done 2 or 3, of asking the same questions, how different people answer. And you start, we've got a visitor. That's awesome. So I think for me personally, it's that instant reaction when you ask the question. I love watching people's faces when I ask the question. Things like, tell me about your experience with Doxers code or whatever. And you'll see sometimes there's that moment where they're trying to parse what you've just said. Oh my goodness, what is Doxers code? And then the very first thing they'll jump to is, well, I had experience with this at this company or whatever, and and trying to see if they move closer to an answer or move closer to a better answer over time. So I guess I wouldn't say there's red and green flags straight up. I mean, unless they're overtly racist or something terribly. I did have one person I interviewed who constantly used he to mean a developer, and I'm just like, yeah, it's not necessarily a red flag, it's just icky feeling. So I wouldn't say I have a red flag or a green flag necessarily. It's just that conversation, seeing how people react, seeing that instant reaction when you ask a question is really interesting, I think.
That's great. We also had some great comments. Brooke said that one thing that she likes to remind herself about people is that you hire for culture add, not culture fit. And then Mo added that culture add is for yogurt, not for tea.
Yes, I liked that. And at the time I was writing the talk, I was reading a particular book, which I think I referenced in there so people can look it up, which does talk a lot about how our brain fools us on things like that. And that was really relevant to me at the time that I was going through some hiring just recently. It's really, really easy to just hire the person that you got along well with, that you had a great chat with, whether or not they've got the relevant experience or qualifications that you look at. Culture fit is great, but it also means you end up hiring clones of yourself. And as I've gone on over the years, I've gotten more and more conscious of that fact. I always wanted to hire my friends. I wanted to hire people I got along really well with. And that's great. I've ended up with some great friends from teams that I've built over the years. I don't regret that at all. But I also I want to be much more conscious of not hiring people who are like me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So both of your talks, we all had questions about drawing parallels between writers and engineers and or programmers. And I think it's often because there's a lot of overlap there. So I'll ask you both questions about that, if that's okay. Chris, Jen was wondering, do you think that some of the challenges that tech writers face when pair writing are similar to challenges that programmers might face when they're pairing? Or do you think that it's different because of the nature of the task that they're doing? I'd be interested to get your thoughts.
I cannot talk on behalf of what programmers go through because I'm not being a programmer, and I kind of understand the model. But some of the challenges, that we try to solve through programming and through peer writing is, how do you onboard somebody who is totally new? And for instance, the examples that I gave were in Ophelia and Meng, who are new to the project, who want to understand the Good Docs project as a whole. How do they put their footstep into the door, right? So they came in, they listened, and then they understood, okay, fine, these are the things that I need to know. This is where my repo is. These are the people whom I talk to. So that gave them a good onboarding experience. That's one. And in terms of writing itself, as I mentioned, Nelson, who is a new to technical writing field, who want to understand the nitty-gritties of technical writing and want to contribute, eager to contribute. That gave him a great platform to run through the process of how technical writing as such works, where I have a little bit of experience, Gayatri has some experience in writing. So we all kind of embraced him into the technical writing process over the period of time. He learned a lot. So that was some of the challenges and also some of the solutions that peer writing has helped.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. For Lana, too, the question from Heather was, do you think that the career tracks for tech writers should closely mirror engineering tracks? Or do you think that we should have something different and something that suits the field better?
I like having the mirror engineering. That works especially well if Docs is part of engineering, because I want my technical writers to feel just as valued and respected as the developers on the team. And to feel like they've got the same kind of career opportunities as well. I think sometimes, especially when you've had developers move into technical writing, it's like all of a sudden they realize all their career prospects are different, or their career path or track is different. And we don't want that. So definitely, especially if technical writing is part of engineering, it should mirror. I think at the moment, our docs team is not part of engineering, but it's a very, very small company as well. So it's a lot more flexible. But I think I like the idea of having that dual track for people. Not everyone wants to go into management. Not everyone is well suited to management. Some people just want to get really, really good at what they do technically without having to lead other people. And speaking as someone with an MBA, I feel like management is a very specific set of skills and knowledge, separate to our technical knowledge, separate to our technical writing knowledge. So yeah, I like the idea of having that dual track personally. And engineering has already done a lot of the hard work and the heavy lifting there for us. So let's borrow from that, definitely.
That's great. Thank you. We're getting close-ish to the end of our time, so I'll ask one more question each. Since we're talking about, what suits a good, good candidates, figuring out how to get them onto that track. One really popular question for you, Lana, was how much do you trust writing tests as part of the hiring process? Because interviewing isn't great. Are writing tests any better?
Nothing's perfect. I've gone back and forth and round on writing tests so many times. I never used to, I did them and then I stopped doing them and now I've started doing them again. My current thinking is they're a valuable tool in the toolbox. I like giving people a simple one-page writing test. I tell people it shouldn't take more than an hour. If it takes them more than an hour to just stop and note where they got up to. I certainly don't want to I don't want candidates spending huge amounts of time on their weekend, especially, remember, of course, women and people of color are generally, or people from more disadvantaged backgrounds don't have that spare time, and I don't want to force them to use it. So I don't like having anything that's going to take a lot of time. And I also don't want to make any hiring decisions based solely on a writing test. I've had people come through the interview process, did really, really well through interviews and bombed out on the writing test. In fact, one of them was the worst writing test I've ever seen, and we hired them anyway. So it's a useful tool in the toolbox. I certainly wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket, though.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Chris, our final question for you. Just in general, if you find that your company's culture maybe doesn't have that collaboration that you're wanting to see, do you have tips on changing that culture and bringing that collaboration just into how people interact with each other to begin with?
Yeah, I work with this company called Atlassian. Blessed to have this culture ad that everybody's talking about. We definitely considered this technique as one of our onboarding techniques. I pitched this idea to our manager, and then she absolutely loved it. So hopefully we would see some change in terms of how we can onboard new technical writers, wherein the goal is simple, wherein we don't have to list all these documents on the company's standards and consistencies. Instead, show them around, be part of one of the docs that they're working on, help them to see how the other person is doing. So that gives more value and more comfort. So that's what we're trying to bring in. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you both. I always love these Q&A periods. Everybody is so engaged, and that's why, unfortunately, there's always more questions than we can answer reasonably, but I'm sure that people are going to be paying you. There's just so much interest in what you have to say, and just we're also grateful that you came to talk to us about it today. So this is just such a great closer to day one. I wanted to thank everybody who's watching for attending. For anybody who still has time, who doesn't need to go to bed like immediately, again, due to time zones, we're going to take a little break, and then we'll have a social event at 5 Pacific. So we hope you can make it. Otherwise, we'll see everybody tomorrow. And thank you again, Chris and Lana. So great to talk to you.